Shepherd dog finds a hedgehog in the garden. What unfolds will surprise you. In the quaint village of Meadowbrook, nestled between rolling green hills and sprawling meadows, life followed a peaceful rhythm. Each house had its own small garden, blooming with wildflowers and vegetables. The air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and the distant sound of sheep bleating in the pastures. For Thomas Bellamy, a retired schoolteacher, this quiet life was perfect. His days were spent tending to his garden, enjoying the company of his loyal shepherd dog Bailey, a handsome canine with a thick golden coat and expressive amber eyes. Bailey was more than a pet. He was a companion, a protector, and a friend. Ever vigilant, he took his job of guarding the house and garden seriously. He had a keen nose for trouble and a heart full of kindness, often surprising Thomas with his gentle demeanor toward even the smallest creatures. Before we continue with the video and dive deeper into the incredible story, I want to ask for your help. I'm aiming to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and your support would mean the world to me. If you've been enjoying this content, please hit that subscribe button and join our growing community. And let me know where you're watching from in the comments down below. It was an early spring morning when the story began. Thomas stood in his garden, a watering can in hand, humming a tune as he inspected his rows of tomatoes and lettuce. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the dewy grass. Bailey trotted alongside him, his ears perked up and tail wagging as he sniffed around the perimeter of the garden. "Morning, Bailey," Thomas said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Anything unusual out here today?" Bailey barked softly, his way of saying everything was in order, or so Thomas thought. As Thomas continued watering his plants, Bailey suddenly froze. His nose twitched, and his ears tilted forward in sharp focus. A faint rustling sound came from the far corner of the garden, near the cluster of lavender bushes. Bailey tilted his head, then bounded toward the source of the noise, his paws barely making a sound on the soft grass. "Bailey, what is it, boy?" Thomas called, setting the watering can down. The dog's bark broke the stillness of the morning, a curious, not aggressive bark. Thomas followed quickly, concern etched on his face. When he reached the lavender bushes, he found Bailey standing motionless, his nose almost touching a small round object nestled in the grass. At first, Thomas couldn't make out what it was. The object seemed to shimmer slightly in the morning light, its surface covered in tiny glinting spikes. Then, as it moved, Thomas realized it was a hedgehog. "Well, would you look at that?" Thomas exclaimed, kneeling down to get a closer look. "A little visitor." The hedgehog, startled by Bailey's presence, had curled itself into a tight ball, its spines sticking out defensively. Bailey, however, seemed unfazed. He sniffed the creature gently, his tail wagging in slow, curious motions. "Careful, Bailey," Thomas warned. "You don't want to get too close to those spikes." But Bailey didn't seem to mind. He lay down on his belly, resting his head on his paws, and continued to observe the hedgehog with a calm and curious gaze. Thomas chuckled at the sight. "Well, you're certainly not your usual guard dog today, are you?" he teased. As Thomas watched, the hedgehog began to relax. Slowly, it uncurled itself, revealing a small twitching nose and tiny black eyes. It looked around cautiously before locking eyes with Bailey. The dog remained perfectly still, his friendly demeanor seemingly putting the hedgehog at ease. Thomas was amazed. "I think you've made a friend, Bailey," he said softly. Over the next hour, Thomas and Bailey stayed near the hedgehog, observing its movements. It explored the garden cautiously, stopping occasionally to sniff the air or nibble on a leaf. Bailey followed at a respectful distance, never once acting out of line. By mid-morning, Thomas decided it was time to take action. "Well, little one," he said to the hedgehog, "it looks like you've made yourself at home, but we can't leave you out here unprotected." He fetched an old wooden crate from the shed and lined it with a soft towel, creating a makeshift shelter. Carefully, he placed the crate in a quiet corner of the garden, away from the main pathways. Bailey watched intently, his tail wagging as if to show approval. When Thomas gently coaxed the hedgehog toward the crate, Bailey stood nearby, his eyes full of concern. The hedgehog hesitated for a moment before waddling into the cozy space. "There we go," Thomas said with satisfaction. "You'll be safe here." That night, as Thomas sat by the fireplace with Bailey curled up at his feet, he couldn't stop thinking about the hedgehog. Where had it come from? Was it lost, or had it been displaced by something? The questions lingered in his mind, but one thing was clear. This small creature had brought an unexpected spark of excitement to their quiet life. As for Bailey, he had taken on the role of the hedgehog's guardian with unwavering dedication. The bond between the two animals was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen, and he couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of an extraordinary story. Little did Thomas know the hedgehog's arrival was more than a chance encounter. It was the start of a journey that would reveal secrets, test their courage, and change their lives in ways they could never have imagined. The following days brought a surprising routine to the quiet life at Thomas's cottage. Every morning, Thomas would step out to check on the hedgehog, which he had taken to calling Pip. The name suited the little creature, whose tiny frame and cautious movements reminded Thomas of a small seed taking root in unfamiliar soil. Bailey's fascination with Pip only deepened. Each morning, as soon as Thomas opened the door, Bailey would dash to the crate, his nose pressing gently against the wooden slats. Pip, in turn, seemed to have grown used to Bailey's presence. It no longer curled into a defensive ball when the dog approached. Instead, it would lift its small head, twitch its nose, and even scurry toward the edge of the crate to meet Bailey's inquisitive sniffs. "You've got yourself a new best friend, haven't you?" Thomas remarked one morning, scratching Bailey behind the ears as they watched Pip nibble on some freshly picked dandelion leaves. Pip's appetite had grown noticeably. Thomas made a habit of gathering leaves, small fruits, and even the occasional cooked egg for the hedgehog. Each offering was met with eager munching, much to Bailey's delight. The dog would lie nearby, watching intently, his tail wagging at the smallest movement from Pip. The bond between the two animals warmed Thomas's heart, but it also deepened his curiosity. Where had Pip come from? Hedgehogs were not uncommon in Meadowbrook, but it was unusual to find one venturing so close to human dwellings during the day. Thomas decided to consult an old friend, Eleanor, who was known in the village as an amateur naturalist. Eleanor lived on the outskirts of Meadowbrook in a quaint stone cottage surrounded by sprawling gardens teeming with life. Birds, butterflies, and bees flitted about as Thomas and Bailey arrived, Bailey carrying his usual air of alertness. "Thomas Bellamy," Eleanor greeted warmly. wiping dirt from her hands as she emerged from her greenhouse. And Bailey, too. To what do I owe the pleasure? Thomas explained the situation, describing Pip's arrival and Bailey's unusual behavior toward the hedgehog. Eleanor listened intently, her sharp eyes glinting with interest. A hedgehog befriending a dog? She mused, tapping her chin. That's not something you see every day. Let me come and take a look. Eleanor accompanied Thomas and Bailey back to the cottage, her basket of tools and notes in hand. When they reached the garden, she crouched by Pip's crate, observing the little creature closely. She said, her voice thoughtful. It's unusual for a hedgehog to be so comfortable around a dog. Normally, they'd remain defensive, but Pip seems to trust Bailey completely. Bailey wagged his tail at the mention of his name, as if agreeing with Eleanor's assessment. Pip might have been displaced, Eleanor continued. Perhaps its original habitat was disturbed by construction, heavy rains, or even predators. It's lucky it found its way here. Thomas nodded. I've been wondering about that. Is there anything more I should be doing for it? You're doing wonderfully already, Eleanor assured him. But if Pip stays, it might be worth creating a more permanent space, something natural, like a hedgehog house. It'll give Pip a place to hibernate when the weather turns colder. The idea of building a proper home for Pip excited Thomas. That afternoon, with Eleanor's guidance and Bailey's ever-present enthusiasm, he began constructing a small hedgehog shelter. They used wood, straw, and dry leaves to create a snug, weatherproof hideaway that mimicked a natural burrow. Bailey seemed to understand the significance of their project. He followed every movement, occasionally nudging a piece of wood or sniffing the straw as if to offer his approval. When the shelter was complete, Thomas placed it in a quiet, shaded corner of the garden, not far from Pip's crate. They gently transferred the hedgehog to its new home, and to their delight, Pip seemed to take to it immediately. You've got yourself a little ecosystem here, Thomas, Eleanor said with a smile as they stood back to admire their work. But as the days turned into weeks, Pip's behavior began to change in subtle ways. It started venturing out of its shelter more frequently, exploring the garden with a confidence that surprised Thomas. It was as though Pip was searching for something or someone. Bailey, ever the attentive guardian, followed Pip's every move. The two animals had become inseparable, often seen lounging together in the sunlight or investigating the far corners of the garden. Thomas had never seen anything like it. One crisp morning, Thomas woke to find Bailey standing at the edge of the garden, his body tense and his ears pointed forward. Pip was at his feet, sniffing the ground with urgency. "What is it, boy?" Thomas called, hurrying over. Bailey let out a low bark, his amber eyes fixed on the thicket of bushes that bordered the garden. Pip, too, seemed agitated, pacing back and forth in short bursts. Thomas knelt down, his heart pounding. He parted the bushes cautiously, unsure of what he might find. At first, there was nothing, just the usual tangle of brambles and fallen leaves. But then he heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from deeper within the thicket. Bailey barked again, his tail wagging with a mix of excitement and determination. Pip let out a series of soft squeaks, as if urging Thomas to investigate further. Driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, Thomas pushed further into the thicket. The rustling grew louder, and soon he came upon a small hollow in the ground. Nestled inside was another hedgehog, slightly larger than Pip, with similar markings and the same cautious eyes. "Well, I'll be," Thomas murmured. "You've got a friend, Pip?" Bailey barked softly, as if in agreement. The larger hedgehog didn't seem frightened by their presence. Instead, it watched them with quiet curiosity, its small nose twitching. Thomas carefully coaxed the new hedgehog out of the hollow, using a soft towel to carry it back to the garden. Pip followed closely, its tiny legs moving with surprising speed. Once they reached the garden, Thomas placed the new hedgehog near Pip's shelter. To his amazement, the two hedgehogs immediately began interacting, nuzzling each other with a familiarity that suggested they had known each other all along. "I think we've found Pip's family," Thomas said, his voice filled with wonder. Bailey wagged his tail furiously, his joy evident. The discovery of the second hedgehog brought a new sense of purpose to Thomas's days. He expanded the shelter, creating a larger space for both hedgehogs to share. Pip and its newfound companion thrived under his care, and Bailey remained their ever-watchful guardian. But the appearance of the second hedgehog was just the beginning. Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Pip's story and that the little creature had led him to something much greater than he could have ever imagined. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet life in Thomas's garden transformed into something extraordinary. Pip and the new hedgehog, whom Thomas had named Clover, quickly settled into their shared shelter. The two hedgehogs seemed inseparable, scurrying around the garden together and foraging side by side. Their bond was unmistakable, and their growing confidence brought new energy to Thomas's home. Bailey, as always, remained a constant presence. He kept a careful eye on Pip and Clover, his wagging tail and playful demeanor signaling his approval of their antics. But Bailey's role as a guardian extended beyond the garden. He had started sniffing out areas around the property that Thomas rarely ventured into, almost as if he were mapping out their world with the precision of a scout. One afternoon, as Thomas sipped tea on the porch, Bailey's excited bark interrupted his thoughts. He watched as the dog darted toward the edge of the property, his tail wagging furiously. Pip and Clover, sensing the excitement, emerged from their shelter and scurried toward Bailey's direction, their tiny feet rustling through the grass. "What have you found now, boy?" Thomas called, setting his mug down and following the trio. Bailey led Thomas to a patch of overgrown shrubs near the boundary of the garden. It was an area Thomas hadn't given much thought to in years, a dense, tangled mess of wild brambles and forgotten growth. But as he pushed aside the foliage, something caught his eye, a small wooden sign, weathered and nearly obscured by moss. Thomas knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal faded letters carved into the wood. The words were difficult to read, but with some effort, he made them out. "Woodland Refuge." A flood of memories rushed back to Thomas. He remembered hearing stories from his grandparents about the land surrounding his home. Decades ago, the area had been part of a larger property dedicated to wildlife conservation. The refuge had been established to protect small creatures like hedgehogs, foxes, and birds, providing them with a safe haven from expanding farmland and encroaching development. Over time, the refuge had been forgotten, its boundaries lost to nature. Thomas's property had once been part of that sanctuary, and now, thanks to Bailey, Pip, and Clover, it felt as though its legacy was calling out to him. Thomas turned to Bailey, who stood proudly by the sign, his chest puffed out, as if claiming credit for the discovery. "You've done it again, haven't you?" Thomas said, scratching the dog's ears. "Looks like we've got some work to do." Over the next few days, Thomas threw himself into action. Inspired by the sign and the stories of the old refuge, he decided to restore the area around his home to its former glory. He cleared out overgrown brush, built small shelters for other wildlife, and planted native flowers to attract pollinators. Bailey was by his side every step of the way, nosing through piles of leaves and fetching sticks, as though he understood the importance of their work. Pip and Clover also seemed energized by the activity. They explored every corner of the expanding garden, their tiny noses twitching with curiosity. Word of Thomas's project began to spread through Meadowbrook. Eleanor, ever the enthusiastic naturalist, returned to offer her expertise. Together they mapped out a plan to turn Thomas's land into a haven for all kinds of creatures. Neighbors stopped by to lend a hand, bringing seeds, tools, and even a few rescued animals in need of a home. The garden became a thriving sanctuary, its once quiet paths now alive with the hum of bees, the rustle of hedgehogs, and the occasional flutter of butterfly wings. Pip and Clover became symbols of the refuge's success, their story inspiring others in the community to think more about the creatures living quietly among them. But the most remarkable moment came one crisp autumn morning. Thomas had just finished spreading straw near the hedgehog shelter when Bailey began barking excitedly. He ran toward the far edge of the garden, where a small group of people had gathered. Among them was a young boy, no older than 10, holding a shoebox carefully in his hands. Thomas approached, curious about the commotion. The boy looked up at him, his eyes wide with hope. "Mr. Bellamy," he said shyly, "I heard about your garden, and I thought maybe you could help." He opened the shoebox to reveal a tiny hedgehog, smaller even than Pip had been when Thomas first found it. The little creature was trembling, its body thin and frail. Thomas's heart ached at the sight. "Of course we'll help," he said gently. "Let's get this little one settled." He led the boy to the shelter, where Pip and Clover were busy munching on some dandelion leaves. As soon as Thomas placed the new hedgehog inside, Pip and Clover scurried over to investigate. To Thomas's amazement, the pair immediately began nudging the newcomer, offering it the comfort and companionship that had once been shown to them. The boy watched in awe as the three hedgehogs interacted, his face lighting up with a smile. "Thank you," he said softly. Thomas patted the boy on the shoulder. "It's what we're here for." Over the following weeks, the garden became a hub of activity. More people came, bringing injured birds, displaced rabbits, and even a family of orphaned ducklings. Each new arrival found a home in the sanctuary, and Bailey, Pip, and Clover welcomed them all with open hearts. Thomas often marveled at how much his life had changed since the day Pip wandered into his garden. What had started as a single act of kindness had blossomed into something far greater, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all living things and the profound impact of compassion. One evening, as the sun set over the sanctuary, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Thomas sat on the porch with Bailey at his feet. Pip, Clover, and the newest hedgehog were busy exploring a patch of fresh grass nearby. Eleanor joined him, carrying a tray of tea. She handed him a cup and smiled. "You've created something incredible here, Thomas." "I couldn't have done it alone," he replied, glancing at Bailey, who was watching the hedgehogs with quiet pride. "It's funny, isn't it? How a little creature like Pip could spark so much change." Eleanor nodded. "It's a reminder that even the smallest lives can have the biggest impact." As night fell, the sanctuary grew quiet, the gentle sounds of rustling leaves and chirping crickets filling the air. Thomas leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace washing over him. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. His garden, once an ordinary patch of land, had become a place of hope, connection, and second chances. And it all began with a shepherd dog, a tiny hedgehog, and the boundless possibilities of an open heart.